Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. We are just going to give it up to a minute just to let other numbers join, and then we would start today's session. Okay, I'm going to get started because I'm sure the hour will be taken up by the wonderful panel and any questions that you have today. So welcome again, everybody, and welcome to Workplace Wednesday of Conflict Resolution Week. This is the third webinar of the week, and it's great to see so many people joining again today and getting involved in these conversations. So today it's looking at about how conflict, it's inevitable. We're never going to stop it from happening. And we're going to be focusing on the workplace, hence the name Workplace Wednesday. But what we've got to do, what we're looking at is we're going to explore that if it's handled well, how it can bring about those stronger relationships, better communication, and more collaboration when working. And then another topic that we're going to be exploring is how moving people away from blame and defensiveness, which is how we tend to respond to situations where we're in conflict, moving more into helping people or ourselves into that problem solving, shared responsibility in the workplace. So for those that don't know me, I'm Kim Logan of ADR Mediation. I started the business 13 years ago and here we are today. So what I'll do is if we go around the panel, and thank you very much to you all for joining us. If you can just introduce yourself and then we'll get the session started. So if I can start with Shelley, please.
Hi, thanks for having me here, Kim. It's brilliant to be here. My name's Shelley Bosworth. I'm a business leadership and mindset coach. I'm based in Dubai and I work around the world.
Thank you, Shelley. Jenny?
Hi everyone, I'm Jenny from Real Talk Consultancy and I'm a difficult conversations and conflict specialist. So I mainly work with senior leadership teams helping them manage conflict. So it's lovely to be here.
Thank you. Anna?
Hello everyone, I'm Anna. I'm part of the ADR team. I do community mediations and conflict coaching, and I do mediations for some other organisations as well.
Thank you. Heather?
Good morning, I'm Heather Skelton. I'm the Head of Restorative Resolutions for an NHS trust in the southeast of England called East Kent University Foundation Trust, and I do a lot of workplace mediation. My background's restorative justice, so I kind of use a restorative approach in the work that I do to repair relationships.
Thank you. And Laura?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Laura Briggs. I'm a HR consultant for Cube HR. We work with a broad variety of clients across various industries, so any manner of conflict is what we also have to deal with day to day, always looking for positive outcomes from those.
Thank you, Laura. And yeah, we've gone national today over in Dubai, which is lovely. So what we're going to start off with is I'm going to start with asking Shelley a question, and then from there we can move forward. But if anybody who is watching this webinar today wants to ask any questions, make any comments, please put them in the chat. If they're relevant as we're talking, we will. If not, there will be a session at the end where we can ask your questions and get answers from there. So please make it as interactive and get as much out of it as you can. But going over to Shelley first, let's start with the question of why do people tend to be more defensive when they're in conflict than look to problem solve initially?
So as I mentioned, I'm business and mindset. So I'm clearly going to start with the mindset piece, right? Which is where everything starts. The first thing I'd say is when it comes to conflict, which is inevitable in life, what we think is happening isn't necessarily what is happening or what is being said. And so it all kind of starts with what we make it mean within ourselves and what we make it mean about ourselves. So that then straight away tends to push us into it's me, I'm the problem, and actually conflict, the very point of conflict is there's a disagreement here. If I lean into this disagreement, what might happen? And so the defensiveness comes from, in short, a lot of stories we make up in our mind before we actually seek to understand what this is about. And because it's conflict, and I'm going to keep using that word because I think if, I asked everybody right now to think about what's the first thing you think about when I use the word conflict, we immediately think negatively, which means we lean into negative thought processes, i.e. defensiveness. And we're protecting ourselves when we do that, but that is the main reason people lean towards defensiveness rather than straight into problem solving, because whilst we might not like to hear this, the first thing we do is we make it about us and we don't even realize we're doing it. So the question we've got to ask ourselves is actually, what am I making this mean about me in order to perhaps look at it differently and seek better solutions to move forward? Because that's when we get stuck. That would be kind of where I'd say it starts.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. Laura?
Yeah, I think Shelley's comments there are really valuable. I always say that when two people approach a situation in any form of relationship, in any walk of life, at best, it is two people navigating each other's insecurities, all these invisible issues that may manifest in ways that the other party does not understand because they have no knowledge of them. So I think in the workplace, often there are those personal insecurities, but there's also often a build-up of issues that haven't been addressed, perhaps perceived unfairness. So what you are seeing when somebody is defensive or possibly going from 0 to 100 is actually weeks, months, years of frustrations, and that becomes the first opportunity that they feel that they can voice those concerns, or it becomes something where they already feel like they're protecting themselves going in, that they're going into an attack. And people do associate conflict or a difficult conversation with their competence being questioned, their character being questioned. So I think that the approach for, management dealing with conflict is to go in with that in mind, so that any conversation is mindful of the potential mindset that individual is in. We may not know the full picture, but there's a broad range of things that could be going on in the background that will dictate their response to even the most tactful or gentle conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you, Laura. And something that I've thought was interesting there and that you just said, and we talk about it a lot, is even though it's the first time, perhaps you're recognizing it in somebody else or in a situation, or they've said it, that they feel that they're in conflict, dispute, with somebody else. It could have been going on for a long, long time before. So we have to recognize that and not treat it as in, oh, this has just started. And I think that's with any conflict, whether it's workplace, community, or anywhere. So I think that was really good. Thank you, Laura. Heather.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Laura. I just wanted to say that I think there's an issue with moral injury as well around this. I think people spend so much time with their work colleagues, more so than their family. And I think there's an assumption sometimes that everybody will behave with the same values and the same core beliefs that we hold. And so when something goes wrong, I think it challenges that idea of kind of that moral injury. It really stings. And it reminds me of thinking about sort of Thomas Kilmann's model, the PIN model, positions, interests and needs. Quite often when people are first sort of have a flashpoint and conflict occurs, they're talking at that positions level. I want this, I want justice, it's my right to have that, it's da 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 da. And they're really asserting their positions and they're not yet ready. I think that's where that defensiveness comes from. It's that initial injury and they're talking like that and they're not yet at that point where they can begin to de-escalate and talk at the needs level, which is where we want them to begin to think about those things. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather. Anna.
Thank you. Yes, I was just going to follow on from what Heather was saying about moving on to talk about at the level of what the needs, talking more, more deeply about the situation. I think when people are under time pressure, and they feel like they're under attack, and naturally everyone's brains take shortcuts and wants to look for how to make this go away quickly. So then the quicker reaction under pressure is to be defending yourself rather than looking potentially to problem solve.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And we'll go to Jenny and then thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add there really, in terms of just to add to what everyone else has just said. I think one of the main things I observe working with people is that when somebody gets defensive, we don't allow that person to be defensive or for us to feel defensive. We shut that down because we're so uncomfortable with it. We don't know what to do with it. Then we get defensive in response. And sometimes it's just going, do you know what? This is a normal human reaction for this person to have. We don't have to necessarily do anything with it. We just have to allow it. It's part of the process. I think we just try and fix it quickly, don't we? And it's just saying, do you know what? That's normal. It's all normal. It's a normal reaction. It's a normal human emotion to have.
Yes,
So
yeah.
true.
Yeah. And I think that's quite leads on nicely to the next question, because we as mediators and other people working in different areas, you've got to allow that to come out, because otherwise you're suppressing that and you're not actually really solving what's going on for that individual. But then there comes a point where you want to help them, work with them to move forward from that. So how can we do that? Whether it's within, with managers, with somebody externally, what things can help that person move from that position of that defensiveness? Laura?
I always like to start these difficult conversations with inviting the individual to share their perspective on the incident, allegation, whatever it may be. Obviously, as management, you're going to have to bring the issue up, but you can do it in a way that invites their perspective first. And I always think then that makes it easier to have the difficult conversation where you can sort of pivot off their responses and work through those so that they feel heard. It reduces the feeling of attack. So that's how I like to begin these, really. I think that there is also an element of whoever is having these difficult conversations is probably a level of management above, or maybe an external. They are handed an issue, for example, this conduct issue, without the background of all those things that we were talking about there, day-to-day insecurities, the history of the conflict that might have been slowly escalating for a long time. So the individual might feel very aggrieved if we just go in around that one incident. So opening it up, I think, allows them to fill in that background from their perspective before we tackle the incident itself or the issue itself.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Shelley?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to build on what Laura's just said, and actually from what Jenny said, I think allowing someone to feel what they feel, and if that's labelled as defensive, the piece about acknowledging that, and then to Laura's point around opening that conversation to, let's assume two people, it can be more than that. I think so often in conflict, it's seen that to find a solution, someone has to be right and someone has to be wrong. And actually, the biggest part of leadership is helping everybody acknowledge that there isn't a right or a wrong here, but there just needs to be a way forward. And, there's a wonderful saying, we can agree to disagree. We can agree to disagree, but that doesn't mean we stay where we are. So I think it's that building on what both Laura and Jenny just said, but the next step of that is, how do we find that way forward? And that, I think Laura's just said this, I would use the word curiosity. It's asking questions. And through the questions, then individuals take some responsibility for that too, rather than being told this is what's going to happen, actually keeping that really open conversation so that everybody's part of how do we move this forward.
Yes, yeah. And I think what can happen is sometimes people will get quite entrenched in policies and procedures within organisations. This is the road we have to follow. This is what we have to do. We'll go to Anna now, please.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to add in something that was mentioned in one of the sessions yesterday about starting with ourselves, starting with calm, and that even from before anyone has even said anything at all, if you can calm yourself, and someone said yesterday, calm is contagious, which I think is so true, that if you bring a sort of nervous, jumpy, what next kind of energy to the conversation, even before you've said anything, the other person is going to pick up on that and going to think, oh no, this is a huge problem, and it potentially, and it isn't. And if you can set the tone with your own calmness and your own stillness, that will make a big difference to how the whole thing goes.
Yes, yeah, and like you say, it's that calmness, and going back to kind of like the policies and procedures, that isn't named in there. You're not really, the policy procedures tell you how you should follow it theory wise, but not necessarily as a human being. And And it can be difficult, even if you're not part of that conflict, being somebody external looking and trying to help the individuals that, you know, through that process. So what do you think organisations do, unintentionally a lot of the time, but that may escalate conflict between people? Heather?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I think sometimes, certainly I've seen this, that some of our policies actually exacerbate conflict, if I'm really honest. I think just the way they're written, they're so robotic and they're so cold. And when you're somebody that's really hurt and harmed and upset, if you've got to wade your way through something that is really kind of just not compassionate at all, it's really unhelpful. We've done quite a lot of training around, like you just said, Kim, around the policy tells you what happens, but it doesn't tell you how. So we've done quite a lot of training around compassionate leadership and compassionate conversations. You know, how do you have those really difficult conversations, but also really show support, kindness, care, compassion, and just hold that space, really. The other thing that I think potentially makes it worse is the time it takes. I don't know if anyone else finds that, but sometimes lengthy, drawn out processes, you quite often find, well, certainly in where I work, we've seen a huge link between when people are in conflict and then the sickness levels in those departments, because the stress and the you know, not being able to show up and do your job well because you're so distracted by the conflict and everything else that's happening. So, you know, I think the time taken and just the way that policies are written, they're just not helpful sometimes.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Shelley?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to organisation bash at this point, but I think, you know, the points that Heather's just raised are so important. You know, I think very often it's an interesting question, because the question you ask is like, where do organisations unintentionally? And I think it's people within organisations that unintentionally kind of exacerbate situations. Yeah. And to the point that Heather made, I think so often the leaders aren't equipped to know how to handle it, because policies and procedures are lengthy, complicated, they avoid. And that then means that things are, oh God, the word I've got is fester. That's not a great word to use, but you know, the longer these things go on, the worse they become. And I do think a lot of leaders in organizations avoid dealing with things, hoping it will just get better. And that in itself kind of then creates further challenges for everyone involved. So yeah, I think it's that I think it's a melting pot of challenges that most people would like to just kind of turn away from and go, it'll be okay. They'll come out in the wash.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. Laura?
Yeah, really building on what Shelley and Heather have said there, I think we have this double-edged sword where perhaps in organisations, you know, I work with varied clients with varied capability levels and training levels amongst supervisory and manager teams. I think particularly in HR, we often put in policies and procedures to help structure and to assist them. But then the flip side of that is that they will follow those robotically and don't have the confidence in people management to have a human conversation. So yeah, I think that can tend to escalate things inadvertently because it over formalizes it. Even if we haven't entered a formal process, if you enter a meeting and say like, okay, I'm having an informal meeting with you about this because that's what the policy says, it's already de facto somewhat formal and less human. We have room in policies for flex and discretion, but I think that they never capture like the varied, wonderful, messy characters of people and all the background that's going on. And I think that's something that has to be captured. So it has to be that, I think, Heather, it was you who mentioned the curiosity to ask the questions and, you know, so to go off piste from, I am having an informal conversation to raise this issue. What's your response? How do we solve it? It needs to be more human and more organic than that. But I think training managers and giving them the confidence through training and upskilling and experience and sort of scaffolding around those processes, modelling of those processes is the way forward for organisations.
Thank you, Laura. Jenny?
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there's often a lot of mismatch as well with what organisations or leadership teams will say they're doing to what they're actually doing in practice. So I think for me, sometimes there's red flags when they'll say, the classic one that I hear quite a lot of is, we're such a happy, gorgeous team. We all get on so well. We never have any conflicts. I'm like, pew, 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 alarm bells going off, because like you said at the beginning, everyone has conflict. Yeah, you can be a great team and you can still have conflict. And actually the best teams that I've worked with are the ones that do have conflict, and I've learned to manage that really well and to have those conversations. So I think for me, it's around the mismatch of, well, yeah, you're saying you're doing that as an SLT, but are you actually doing it in practice? And often they think they're doing it, but they're not. So which leads me on to the next observation that I see a lot of, which is so common, that people don't feel safe to have these conversations. And again, often leaders and managers will think that they're creating that safety, and yet they're not. And again, a lot of that's that leading by example. Well, are you actually showing that it's safe for people to come to you and give you feedback? Or are you doing the opposite to that? Are you shutting people down? So there's so much there for me around the psychological safety as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jenny. Heather?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump on what Laura just said about, flexing policy and how that trips us up sometimes. And there's just a really lovely expression that I use quite a lot when I'm supporting managers, is that policy should be a handrail, not a handcuff. And I think it's really important to remember that we can support our leaders to utilize policy, but it doesn't mean that they have to just kind of go into that kind of robotic mentality. So yeah, it's just something to follow on what Laura was saying. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna?
Thank you. I was just going to just to continue what Jenny was saying about people feeling safe to raise things. I think it's easy to assume that if someone's got something important to say, that they will say it, but that's not actually the case. People, I think, won't say it until they think somebody is going to hear it, and they may say it to various other colleagues outside of work and so on, but they won't actually say it to the manager or the senior leadership team if they don't think it's going to be heard. So I think, like Jenny was saying, if it doesn't feel safe to say it, those issues are never going to be raised, and they're going to bubble away under the surface without an opportunity to address them.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And that kind of leads me on to the next point. I think that leads quite nicely into, we tend to be quite reactive. So we respond to conflict when it's brought to the table, and two people or one person or several people, go A, B, C, D, as opposed to perhaps being able to recognise those signs before. And I just wondered if there's anything that you feel could be seen before that may indicate that there's something not quite right, that there's people not getting on. What are your thoughts on that? Laura?
I think this actually builds on what Jenny was just saying there, like creating the space for it. And I think that having regular conversations and knowing your people is what will allow you to spot those signs. Management are likely to be somewhat removed from the day-to-day, where these small things that wouldn't even hit our sort of standard of misconduct, but do annoy people and fester away day to day, these little gripes. So I think creating the space for them to, the contact and the touch points for those issues to be raised is what will sort of not necessarily prevent the conflict from happening, but it will be on your radar that there is something bubbling away, and give the opportunity for early intervention rather than waiting for a grievance or an allegation or something to become more serious. And that conversation, the more serious conversation, becomes an accusation, then it's defensive, then there's an attack. So I think the early intervention is key, and creating the space to allow people to, express any frustrations earlier on, even if they're not big frustrations. The space to have those conversations is absolutely vital.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Thank you. Shelley?
I mean, as I've just listened to Laura, I'm not sure I'm going to add anything more, because essentially, I think the biggest opportunity to deal with conflict is communication, but we have to have it's creating a safe space for that communication. I was when I was thinking about this entire conversation, I came across something, and the statement was really simple: conflict is information, not a problem. And it's that, if we can reframe it that and really look at what's this telling us, and how do we use that to open up the channels of communication, that can do so much good. I think, you know, your question around, can we spot the signs? I'm almost nervous to start saying you could look for these things, because they could be signs of so many things. But I think in direct contrast to me saying, hey, the answer to conflict is communication, the biggest sign of conflict is silence.
Mm-hmm.
And that would also, for me, be the biggest sign, to Jenny's point about safe space. If people don't feel safe, they're not going to speak up. So I think that's the number one thing I would say. You know, if you're finding yourself speaking to a group of people and not getting an awful lot in response, something's misaligned. And let's remember, that's what conflict is. It's not necessarily two people at each other's throats. Conflict is a disagreement, a misalignment. And if you're getting silence, that could be a signal that there's some misalignment somewhere.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Shelley. Jenny?
Yeah, I think as well, I totally agree with that silence thing. I think that's often one of the biggest signs. I think, like Shelley's just said, we often think of people, you know, at each other, don't we, in the full-blown conflict version, but sometimes it is people are just shutting down, disengaging, not contributing. And I think, just to add to Laura's point as well, of when we're communicating and we're asking our staff teams for feedback, is to do something with that. And if we're not going to do anything with it, to tell them that as well, and to explain the reasons why we're not doing something with it. Because again, it's kind of that one thing I hear all the time is, well, I give feedback and I do openly communicate, but nothing ever gets done about it. So that is going to shut your people down. They're not going to keep coming to you with ideas and things. And then the other thing for me to kind of keep a lookout and a listen out is the gossip. So the jungle drums that are going on, you know, what are people whispering about? What are they talking about to each other and not actually talking to you as leaders and managers about? And again, I'm not suggesting you jump on every single bit of gossip that's going on, otherwise that'd be your full-time job. But it's just keeping that, you know, keeping your ear out, really, of if there's consistent things that you're thinking, well, such a body keeps coming to me and saying that the teams are talking about this, then that's time to have that conversation. Nip things in the bud as soon as you possibly can, because like we said this morning, the longer this goes on, the harder you're making it for yourself. In so many ways.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Heather?
Yeah, just to sort of back up what Jenny was just saying, I think it's all about early resolution wherever you can, really, as soon as it sort of occurs. But one of the things that I think is quite helpful to do is to any kind of team development that you do where you're getting people to talk is preventative in terms of actually conflict escalating. And I think that gets diluted a lot. I observe a lot of team meetings where they just come in, they get straight down to business, and it's very transactional about what's happening. And I always try and say, look, what about if you just started with a check-in? Just, you know, go around, how's everyone feeling on a scale of 1 to 10? How are people? So you're almost, what you're doing is taking a temperature check of how people are feeling and engaging. So almost like, I think it's really helpful sometimes to audit what your team is kind of feeling, a bit of a, you know, whether you do that through surveys. I mean, we use a tool called Team Engagement and Development, TED tool, which is great. And it just supports managers in taking that kind of temperature check about how are people feeling about the environment, the atmosphere of that team. And I think, you know, creating things like team charters. How do we want to behave towards each other? What is the norms here? You know, how can we behave to get the best out of each other? Anything we can do to have those kind of conversations kind of you know, before conflict arises, I think is really, really preventative and helpful, however you do that. But what it does is it gets people used to being open and honest. It's creating that safety so that then when conflict arises, which it inevitably will at some point, it's much easier then to kind of get into those conversations about, okay, let's have a chat about what perhaps isn't going well, what's not working. It's much easier if you've collaborated at the start to get the team to agree what the norms are around behaviours and expectations.
Thank you, Heather. Shelley?
Yeah, I'm joining the dots between what we're all saying, and I think we are all saying the same things in different ways. And you know, I've got in my head, I'm thinking about the safe space. We talked about the communication, everything Heather just said. The word I just wrote down while everyone was trust. You know, it's how do we help teams build trust? And trust isn't I know each other, you know each other inside out, and you're best friends. Trust is I can say something to you and there won't be a repercussion that I can't handle. And there's two parts to that. There's how do I handle it, but there won't be a repercussion that is a really negative consequence on us. And I think that's what we're all saying here. It's in order to navigate, not avoid, but navigate conflict, which is inevitable, because conflict is an opportunity as well to bring in different opinions, to think differently. We have to create cultures of trust that it's okay to say something different to what everybody else is saying.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. Laura?
I just wanted to emphatically agree with these things around trust. I think one of the things that I hear often when it gets to conflict stage is nothing ever happens, nothing ever changes. So I think it's building on what Jenny was saying about making sure that there is follow through, whether that is the outcome that they wanted or whether it's not, but follow through and explain to them why. Because I think that erosion of trust completely eradicates the safe space to discuss the issues. So I think trust is key. Trust that when you have an issue, you raise it early because you're confident that your manager will hear you, listen to you, take you seriously, and take some form of action, whether that's exploring it with the other parties, whether it's a no on whatever they're suggesting, but just that acknowledgement that informal behind the scenes conversation process happened and you got your answer on it. I think it's really, really key.
Thank you, Laura. Jenny?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what everybody said then, and around what Heather was saying about checking in with your team and how are people feeling. And often I'll do, even at the start of a training session, that quick, write one word down or a phrase of how you're feeling right now. And again, you don't have to necessarily do anything with it. It's a check-in, you know where people are at. You can ask curious questions if you want to, even if it's a check-in and before you start a meeting or you have any conversations, that's a great place to be. And I think for me, it's getting the team, as Heather was saying, of what the norms and expectations are. It's getting the team to decide what's okay. It's like levels of okayness, and the team decide that themselves of what is okay in this room for us to share, what would be out of bounds, so what would not be okay for us to share as a team or as a group or whatever that is. And even in a pair, in one-to-ones and appraisals and things, having those conversations around okayness and what's acceptable, and almost getting, like, I think it was Heather who said before about like an agreement in place, and that might change, that might flex over time, but just getting that basic foundation in place, it's well worth investing that time at the beginning to get those things in place. And I think Shelley mentioned about repercussions as well, of that's often a massive fear in it of, well, what if we have this conversation and what if this and what if that? And, the repercussions and fear behind it are absolutely huge. So have those conversations. Well, okay, what if we have a conversation and I upset you? What if I offend you? What if I make you angry? And have those up front before it happens of, well, I'm trying not to go too far with this, but things like, well, if you were angry or peed off with me, how would I know that? So it might be that, I don't know, Laura says, well, I'd storm off and slam the door, so I know that. Or it might be, well, I shut down. So again, it's that getting to know the people you're working with as well as you can.
Yeah.
To spot those signs as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And it's one of the words that I've got written in capital letters down, and Shelley's already said it, is trust. That was one thing that was coming out of all those conversations. And that safe person, because in organisations with, and when you're at work, will tell your manager, but that may not always be the right person. And we deal with cases, with mediations, where actually the reason that some of the conflict is feeling worse in the workplace is because they do have personal things going on as well. So they're trying to manage those as well as what's happening in the workplace. There can be a fear that if I say to my manager, I'm really struggling, well, what's that going to happen to my job? I can't lose my job. It can escalate within them, and it's finding that person, that culture, whatever that looks like, for that person to go, I do need help. I'm really struggling at the moment. And I think going back to what you were saying, Laura, before about approaching it as in what's happening from your point of view, because cases that come from mediation, a lot of the time we can see what's happened is one person's put a grievance in, and then they've gone to the others and said, this has happened, this is what's been said about you. And they may be sat there going, I've been going through very similar, I just haven't come to you because I've not felt assured it's right. Yeah. So it's exploring the why, and it's being curious, what's led to this? Because as we talked before about early intervention, okay, it's been reported now, but how long has it been going on for? What's happened previously? And I think so. Something that Sophie's put into the chat is great discussion, which it's fantastic, and I think it could probably go on all day. But she said, I think many organisation employers have become incredibly risk adverse, as we are in a culture of liability, blame and compensation, which is very true. Because of this, managers aren't supported if they try to do anything other than follow procedures to the letter, even when they know the team member or issue needs a different approach. What can we do to empower individual managers in this sort of environment to reduce the fear factor and be more person-centred? Would anybody like to?
My little hand icon's gone, sorry.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go to Jenny and then I'll come to you, Laura.
Yeah, I think a massive thing for me is that education piece that Laura was talking about, of the people who are often writing the policies and procedures aren't necessarily the people who are having the conversations, or the people who are writing how it should be. And as was it Sophie, did you say, sorry, who'd asked? Yeah, as Sophie was saying, that isn't always the best approach. So it's, for me, it's an education and learning piece right at the top to say that actually there's all these other ways as well. Because certainly I'm sure that the work that we all do sat here today on the panel, there isn't an answer, is there, for everything? There's so many different ways of working, there's so many different questions. And I think the fact that Sophie's recognising, that every single person is a human and is so different, there will be different approaches. So for me, it's an education piece and a learning piece.
Thank you, Jenny. Laura?
Yeah, I was going to talk about the training there. I think that, policies and procedures and training sort of have the same thing, same flaws in them, in that when you put something on a PowerPoint, these are formal sentences in black and white. I've done it where I've delivered training and I'm like, this is how you could start a conversation. But I'm talking to maybe supervisors in a manufacturing environment. That's not their voice. That's not how they'd have this conversation with a real individual in their team. So I think the key to good training around this is modelling those conversations in a realistic way that they can actually take away. I've been to lots of training in my career where it's textbook good. Is it something I can apply in my working environments? No. So I think we really do have to give them the confidence through realistic conflict resolution, not on paper, black and white text. You start the conversation by saying, like, that situation seemed to frustrate you today. How did that make you feel? If that's not how a manager may speak and it's not how it may land with a colleague, then it's not useful to them to give them those prompts. So yeah, I think that modelling aspect of training and the sort of role play aspect of training, particularly for conflict resolution and difficult conversations, is absolutely key. I do have a complete wild card here as well, but just about escalating things. I think we're seeing, with the advent of AI and ChatGPT, particularly in HR, I'm seeing things go formal from the employee straight away now as well. And they are very 0 to 100 breach of X, Y, and Z legislation. So I think that that's almost forcing employers to go formal in response, because it removes the opportunity for an informal conversation. I mean, that's probably not something within our control, whether they choose to submit a long legalistic grievance. But again, I think it comes back to, if you have a culture of trust, you want them to come to you to vent the problem rather than vent it into ChatGPT, which automatically goes for worst case scenario, the most cynical. So I think that's something that is escalating things at the present time, like the present context.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, it's something that we've heard a lot recently, how people's language has all of a sudden gone more formal and in some cases legal, which is not always correct in all areas of conflict because of good old ChatGPT, which is good in some areas, but obviously not everywhere. Yes, over to you, Shelley.
Well, if only we could use these tools for some of the greater good stuff as well, right? And flip it the other way. How can I have a better conversation? Interesting. When I first put my hand up, I was going to say something, kind of add something else. And as Laura continued, I want to again build on what you've said. But it's actually what Heather said first, and Jenny built on, and Laura's added to. The question that's been asked is how can we empower individual managers to reduce the fear and be more person-centered? When we talk about policies and training, we're talking about push. This is how we do it, and we push that down. But actually, when we talk about the empowerment and person-centered, I think pull. And Laura, you did a brilliant little role play on your own there. It was fabulous. I know we joked about it before we all came on. But the word you've all used again is that questions piece. And I think if I were speaking to Sophie in terms of empowering managers, it would be, how can I help those managers to learn better questions? If you want better answers, ask better questions. And questions open things up, statements close them down. And so it's just that piece around, and it is all in the training and support. And I wish I had a magic wand for everybody, but I don't. But it's so interesting, as I'm listening, we are saying the same things. We're talking about safe place, we're talking about trust, we're talking about communication, we're talking about questions. So I think the beauty of that is we're repeating, because as hard as conflict is, it doesn't have to be as difficult as we think to navigate it. Mm-hmm. Because we are all saying the same things here, and actually they're relatively simple. Now, simple isn't always easy. I say that all the time with my clients, but simple is easier than hard. So yeah, I just think the questions piece is really important.
Jenny, over to you.
I just wanted to chuck in at this point, one of the most powerful questions that you can ask people in so many different scenarios and it's, what would you like to have happen? So if, for instance, like Laura's just said there, because I'm seeing that a lot as well, I get involved in quite a lot of mediations as well, and I see this a lot where it's like you say, because of AI and a whole variety of things are going more formal, or staff teams are being empowered that much but in the wrong way and they're going straight to the formal procedure of, right, these are my rights, this is what I can claim, this is how far I can take it. So like Laura said there, I think sometimes as a manager, when you get that straight through, your automatic responses is that defensiveness, and is very much that, well, I'm going to respond in a formal way, rather than getting that person in and going, right, I've got this letter of complaint or whatever it is, this formal procedure. I'm just curious, what would you like to have happen as a result of you sending this letter? And it goes from 100 all the way down. It plummets. It's got nowhere else to go because they're not expecting that response. So it diffuses it immediately. And of course, you can use that question for all kinds of things, to set up a team meeting, in a one-to-one, what would you like to have happen? If this meeting was to go exactly how you'd want it to go, how would that look? How would it sound? How would it feel? So that these are great questions to just instantly diffuse.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Laura?
Yeah, I think that because Sophie's question was around businesses being or organisations being so risk averse, and I think that the tendency then is to sort of look at worst case scenario, and then you end up viewing a human conflict through the lens of a tribunal from the outset, and I think that forces people into, like, we'll follow our ACAS tick box process then, or we'll follow our process tick box out of fear, really, because you're already preempting the worst case scenario and how would this be viewed by a judge at tribunal. I think that what we tend to forget is that we're looking at a range of reasonable responses from an employer, and would having a human conversation with someone be a reasonable response? Yes, it would. Conflict can be messy and muddy, and it might not run smoothly. We might not get perfect outcomes from it. It might lead to further conflict if things aren't fully resolved and that kind of thing. And I think that that's still reasonable. It's still within a range of reasonable responses for it to pan out like that. I think as long as you're not falling outside of the overall framework of your policy, and of course not ACAS codes of practice, the fear of doing reasonable human response in there shouldn't be neglected, or shouldn't prevent you from acting.
Thank you, Laura. And Anna?
Thank you. Yes, I was just thinking, as a, just adding only really to what's already been said, the combination of potentially people reaching for AI to generate their responses, which is understandable if, putting together, their thoughts in writing is not something, necessarily people do routinely, then reaching for AI is understandable. But then you've got a combination of AI, which is not, in fact, reflecting necessarily what they actually feel, what they actually think. It's reflecting what ChatGPT thinks you should say in this situation, combined with a manager who's potentially reaching for scripted responses which are not what they think or they feel either. And then suddenly you've got two people together, and neither of them are the words they're using, neither of them are actually what they mean. And I was thinking then Jenny's question is so helpful in those kind of situations to bring it back to what do you actually want here? So sort of setting aside the script and ChatGPT, potentially there's actually a like Shelley was saying, potentially it's relatively simple when you get past those things that are appear to be helpful, like the script, but can actually become barriers.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And I think we've got 15 minutes left, so if anybody's got any other questions, please put them in chat. But one of the other things that I'm hearing and listening to as well is the leaders and managers are humans as well, and they're probably having to deal with a lot of big teams or their own situations and KPIs and getting reports in. And what perhaps are there
Has Kim frozen?
Yes, I think we've lost Kim, haven't we?
Oh. Yeah.
I assume the question then was going to be around, managers have their emotions too. How do they bring or not bring their emotions to that conflict?
It's a good question, Laura.
It is a good question. Perhaps we run with that.
I'm just assuming. I'm trying to fill in the blanks.
I like what you did there.
It's all
I like what you did there.
I think to answer that, Laura, I think for me, again, it goes back to something that we said earlier that we spoke about right at the beginning of the session, in that you are allowed as a manager to also bring your stuff as well. You are, we're, like Kim was just saying then, you're human as well. So it's okay to say, actually, I'm feeling a little bit anxious about this conversation, or actually, that what you've just said there's made me angry or has made me frustrated or whatever. It's okay to bring our stuff as well, within reason, of course, because it isn't, if it's not about you, it's the focus isn't on you. But I think a lot of the times when I'm delivering training, it's, well, we can't show up like that, or we can't show emotion. And what happens if I get upset and I cry? Well, then you get upset and you cry, and we deal with that. So it's, again, it's that managers believing that they have to be this perfect person, stony face with no emotion, and that isn't how it works. That isn't how we work as humans. That isn't what helps us build that connection and that trust and safety. So it's just giving yourself permission that you are allowed to show up in any way that you want to show up, and just know that there will be different responses to that as well. If anything, it helps you build that rapport more and breaks down that builds the trust and breaks down those barriers quicker.
Sorry, that was my first technical hitch of the day, of the week, should I say, but it looks like you've carried on well, so I will go over to Heather and try and catch up where everybody's up to.
Yeah, just following on from Jenny, really. And the other thing I think is, vulnerable leaders, great, and we need to acknowledge that. But also, I think we need to move away from this idea that sometimes there's weakness in a manager or a leader saying, I'm not the right person to actually try to resolve this conflict because I'm invested in it. And I think sometimes leaders are, because they know their teams so well, and they're invested in that, and it's not that they're part of the problem, but they've been impacted by the conflict, which sometimes makes it very, very hard for them to hold that space and to be completely independent, impartial, neutral, all the things that we would expect from a you know, in a mediation process to try to resolve conflict. I think the message should be to our leaders that that's not a weakness to say, do you know what, I'm not the right person. That's actually a huge strength, because what you're doing is you're recognizing, you know, you want the best for your staff, and so actually sometimes removing yourself is probably the best thing that sometimes we can do. Yeah, it's just my thoughts.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree, Heather. Thank you. Shelley?
I mean, I'm going to say exactly what Heather just said. And actually, if I think back to my previous life of being a leader, you know, I definitely did the two phases of, I'm a leader, I shouldn't show any vulnerability, I shouldn't tell anyone I haven't got all my, you know, what sorted. I know, you know, I can handle this, I can compartmentalize. Funny enough, I can't, I'm human. And my best leadership roles were when I was human, in control. I didn't, you know, lose it and things, but actually showed my people that I was struggling sometimes, or had the honest conversation, because that creates so much more trust. So to the point you made, Heather, I think that shows greater strength. And I'm not blowing my trumpet, I'm talking about all the leaders I work with. I will encourage people to be more vulnerable, to be more honest, to show that it's okay to be honest. Now, you know, we absolutely have to do that in the right measured way, but equally to be okay with saying, actually, I don't know the best way forward. Perhaps we should seek support or expertise elsewhere, because we all want to move forward, and that's ultimately the leader's role, to kind of take it forward.
Thank you, Shelley. Laura?
Yeah, more of the same from me, really. I think that we have this myth of the infallible leader, and I think that leaders often take that on themselves as well, and then they struggle to sort of come down from that position in conflict. And sometimes in conflict, there are factors within the organisation that may contribute to it. So you may have this conflict that's been ongoing, but it's exacerbated and comes to the surface when maybe there are workload pressures, or there are other workplace factors outside the conflict that bring the conflict to the surface. And I think that there is no problem in a leader saying, you know, like, is there anything that we can do in work, you know, not just the two individuals, like you two, you three, whoever it may be, you've got a problem amongst yourselves. Is there anything that, you know, we as leaders or we as an organisation can take responsibility for? And I think that admitting that there might have been some contribution from other factors that we have a hand in is great. I think that springboards into a more positive solution conversation. You know, we can have some mediation or resolve conflicts between the individuals involved, but what can we do as an organisation that would help this? What's exacerbated the situation that we do have control over, that we can improve for you? And I think that's the segue into the more positive conversation coming out of the conflict. Resolving the issue between the individuals is one aspect, and then looking at those preventative organisational or department-wide measures going forward. And to do that, you have to have the vulnerability to admit, you know, maybe things have gone wrong. Maybe I haven't had as regular check-ins. Maybe whilst this project was going on, I was spread a bit too thin, that kind of thing. And I don't think that there is a problem with that kind of vulnerability. I think leaders fear, well, if I admit anything, it will be held against me, or, you know, we'll get a claim off the result of my admitting that something went wrong. Admitting it going wrong is fine. Admitting it was wrong and then resolving it is the progress, and you can't be faulted for doing that.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And over to Anna.
I was just going to return to something Heather said about mediation and taking part, you know, the potential for mediation, taking part in mediation. I think obviously mediation is always important to have vital to have the right people in the room, but I think there's also a potential for waiting until the perfect moment, and the perfect moment won't come. And actually somebody else may, recognizing that the two people who had the issue, maybe one of them won't do mediation, but perhaps there is somebody else who could also do mediation, and that would move things a little further forward, rather than waiting for that perfect moment, which is highly unlikely to arrive.
Yeah, thank you. So with only 5 minutes left, I thought just to kind of go around the panel, and if you could just give kind of maybe a tip or an action for participants to take away today that might just help them, whether it's they're a mediator themselves or in the workplace, they're a leader, something that they, that might just help them recognise conflict or respond to it themselves. So if we start, it's never easy to start with anybody, because I can see in everybody's face you're trying to think of something. So to be fair, I'm just going to go round the room in order. So Laura.
Oh, sorry, I haven't muted then. I was scribbling away. Sorry, could you repeat the question there? I was just writing some notes.
No, it's all right. Just a tip or an action for attendees to take away for today, just to help them deal with conflict.
Early intervention, creating space for those touch points. A question that we use actually on our one-to-ones is, what is everybody thinking but not saying? And I think that's really, really useful. It sort of captures the gossip element of it, and I think that's where you get all those issues. But yeah, creating space for those early conversations for people to raise day-to-day gripes, not formal workload issues, etc. What's getting on your nerves? What's eating at you this week? Those kinds of conversations.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. Heather?
I just, to encourage everybody that managing people is tricky. People are peoply, and they, when conflict happens, they get a bit prickly, and it's just about not kind of being afraid to go there, being afraid to sit with the uncomfortable. I think, we have to normalize conflict, particularly in the workplace. It happens, it's there. It's just not being afraid to kind of just do something. Doing nothing is the worst thing we can do. Doing something, attempting something is always the best way forward. And that would be. And the only other thing I would say is that just to remember that policy is a handrail, not a handcuff. And if it feels at odds to how you would have a conversation with someone, then that's probably your gut telling you that you know what this person needs, and just be brave and have that conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Heather. Anna?
Yes, I was just going to say to start with listening. If you're not sure what else to do, and you need to do something, and you don't know, like Heather was saying, you need to do something, not nothing, then listening is a good place to start. Let the other person, let the other person speak. Don't be too quick to try and, give your point of view.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Jenny?
I'm not going to lie, there's a million things buzzing around my head that I want to share.
Well, we've got 3 minutes, Jenny.
Which one would be more useful? As we've only got a minute, I will keep it brief. One of the lovely exercises that I know people find super powerful, so I'm going to share that because I think you can do it. You can spend as much or as little time as you want. You can, it can be a 60-second thing. It can be a 2-hour thing. So write down what your fears are. So about having these conversations, whether it's to do with conflict, whether it's a difficult conversation, what is it you're actually terrified of? And then linked with that of what are all the what ifs buzzing around your head. So if you're what if this person takes it to a grievance, what if I lose a friendship over it, what if I lose trust, what if, get them all written down on paper, because sometimes, and quite often, even that visual and that offloading from the brain to the paper, it is enough to let you just make, like the others have said, to help you start having those conversations and stop putting things off. So again, we're not fixing it, we're not doing anything with it, we're acknowledging that it's there. And that for me is such a powerful exercise for people. And just leading on to that to end with, I would say, learn to sit in the discomfort, because this stuff can be uncomfortable. And the more we learn to sit in that discomfort, there is another phrase, but it's a more sweary phrase, so I'll save that for another time. But sit in that discomfort and get used to being uncomfortable until you're more comfortable.
Thank you, Jenny. And Shelley?
Everything everyone said, I'm going to repeat Laura's first piece, and that is early intervention. So earlier conversations are much easier conversations, but I'm going to bookend conflict basically. So I'm going to say, get curious early and start those conversations, ask those questions. And then I'm also going to say, you know what, when you come out the other side, remember what I said earlier, conflict is information, not a problem. So reflection after resolution. Learn from the situation you've just experienced, because if you don't, nothing changes and you're going to be back there again. So the 2 bookends: early intervention, ask the questions, reflect after the resolution.
Thank you very much. And that has now taken us to 11 o'clock. So thank you so much to the panel. Thank you for keeping it going whilst my internet went down. The joys of Teams, there's lots of advantages to it, but every so often there's a disadvantage. But I think it's been a fantastic webinar today. I'm sure everybody that's joined has got a lot from it. This afternoon we've got a lunch and learn run by Emma Jenkins at 12:30 on conflict styles. So if you want to join that, there's a link on the website for you to be able to go and join that. Tomorrow, we're having a day off from the webinars and the lunch and learns because we're actually doing the conference tomorrow. So I'll still be talking, just in a different place with no internet issues, hopefully. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. Amazing thank you to the panel because it's just been, yeah, really, really good. And I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.